We're going to get more details, and we will continue to share our experience inside that ballroom. But now let's go to senior White House correspondent Peter Doocy, who was also there when the shooting unfolded. Good morning, Peter.
Good morning. And as I got home last night, I got a call from President Trump, who I had been trying to reach throughout this chaotic situation. And I had a chance to ask him some things that I did not ask him at the briefing, namely, when this was happening and the detail was taking him out and the counter-assault team came onto the stage, which is very similar to what we saw in Butler, was he thinking about Butler? He says that he was not, and that he thinks the Secret Service did a much better job last night than they did in Butler when he was actually shot in the ear. He did have this briefing last night, though, which was part of a room filled with people who got here as quickly as they can, many who did not have the proper credentials because people don't stick their White House hard pass into their cocktail attire. But I did have a chance to ask the president this.
Respectfully, why do you think this keeps happening to you?
Well, you know, I've studied assassinations. The people that make the biggest impact, they're the ones that they go after. When you look at the people that have either, whether it was an attempt or a successful attempt, they're very impactful people. I hate to say I'm honored by that, but I've done a lot. We've done a lot. We were a laughingstock for years, and now we're the hottest country anywhere in the world. We've changed this country, and there are a lot of people that are not happy about that.
And this is what that question was getting at. You look at July 13th, 2024, the Butler assassination attempt on President Trump. A couple months later, September 15th, 24, there was a second assassination attempt on the president. April 13th of last year, there was arson at Governor Josh Shapiro's home. June 14th of last year, the Minnesota House Speaker and her husband were fatally shot. Then, of course, Minnesota Senator John Hoffman and his wife were shot that same night. September 10th of last year, Charlie Kirk was fatally shot. And then last night, a gunman tried to shoot his way into the White House Correspondents' Dinner. Hakeem Jeffries, the top Democrat in Congress, posted this. He said, "Thankful for the swift law enforcement action to protect everyone from the gunfire at the White House Correspondents' Dinner, praying for the safety of those who may remain in harm's way, and violence and chaos in America must end." And we heard what this gunman apparently told law enforcement officials about his desire to do harm to Trump administration officials. When I was talking to the president, he is, and the things that he's been hearing, he is of the understanding that this guy was trying to essentially break down the door, shoot his way through the door, and then go right up that center aisle and shoot as many people as possible. Back to you guys.
So, Peter, you know, that was such talk about surreal. The surrealness continued into the evening with that press conference in the White House press briefing room. I've never seen anything like that. I don't think you've ever seen anything quite like that. Everybody's still dressed up, come directly from the dinner at a time when everybody was still supposed to be sitting around at that dinner, which is supposed to be a lighthearted affair. What was the mood in the Brady press briefing room?
I think people were pretty rattled because just about everybody except the folks from an in-town pool who have to stay here in case of something really bad happening, like last night, everybody was in cocktail attire. And I was sitting next to the CBS News White House correspondent, Weijia Zhang, who was on the stage with President Trump. And people were understandably very rattled. It seemed like people were pretty upset. And it's one of those times where the president is not coming out to give us an update on something that has been building up for a long time. He was out there basically to reassure everybody watching who was concerned for his safety that he was okay. And they had this whole show of force. It wasn't just the people, the reporters there wearing tuxedos and bow ties. The top folks for the entire country, the people basically that run the whole world, were up there on the stage. They had all just experienced the same exact thing. And I later in the press conference, I had a chance to ask the president whether or not this is something, after Butler, his campaign team and the Secret Service put their heads together and they decided outdoor events just are not safe. It is too hard to secure an outdoor event for President Trump. It seems like indoor events, even though the president says that indoor events will continue, because if you don't have the indoor events, then you really don't have anything going on. But we should expect in the coming days to hear about major security improvements, including that could include President Trump having to wear a bulletproof vest when he is out in public. Because, yes, this person with the gun who was staying at the hotel and came downstairs, that's a very hard thing to defend against. And they did defend everybody in the room against that. But he still got way too close with a gun. And so there are going to be major changes to the protocol here. Like we will hear a lot about the plan working, and it did work because none of the protectees or guests were injured or killed. But that's way too close, and so I expect that.
Yeah, Peter, earlier I said that the suspect was killed. I should have said he was taken into custody. But when we were laying on the floor, we were informed that the suspect had been killed. And of course, that had been corrected. He was taken into custody. I want to ask you this because after I got up and had to wait for my husband to come back because he had been pulled out of the room by his security detail, there was an announcement that things might continue. And we immediately knew that that was President Trump probably arguing with his wife and Secret Service, saying, I want to come back out. And there was sort of a debate going on. You were there. He immediately said that's exactly what had happened, that he wanted to come back out, but he was, basically told you can't, you got to follow protocol this time. And he came back and gave that press conference, as you know, from the White House press room. You were able to see the First Lady. What was your impression of her at that moment, so close to the time that this potential assassination occurred?
She did not want to make any public comments on camera last night, but she was standing right there with President Trump. And according to all accounts, she is one of the ones who told the president that this is a very serious situation based on, and there is audio. You can hear the gunshots in most of the audio clips if you just go to scrub through to the right time. And so the president says that she's the one who said this sounds serious as the detail was rushing through. But in terms of, and I've heard from a couple different people that President Trump was trying to, he was in a hold room there at the Hilton. They didn't take him right out. And the reporters who were with him in the motorcade for the short ride back to the White House say that eventually when they did leave, it was the fastest motorcade that they have ever been in, which is remarkable because you think about these places that we go with the president, you're on highways, you're in foreign countries where the cars go really, really fast. And so for cars on surface streets in Washington, D.C. to be driving as fast as some of these people who go with him everywhere, every day have ever experienced, that is remarkable. But in terms of not putting him back in the room, and you guys were there was so much confusion about what exactly was going on. Nobody ever made an announcement for everybody to, like an official never made an announcement that everybody needed to get down or to hit the deck, because and you can tell when you see these counter assault officers on the stage, they didn't know where the threat was coming from. And because of that, that's why they couldn't send the president back out.
All right. Well, thank you, Peter. Great reporting.
Be sure to like and subscribe for all the Fox News latest on YouTube and catch full shows streaming now on Fox One.